The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of Chicago's municipal court building, casting long shadows across the cold, marble floors of courtroom 304. It was 8:45 a.m., and the courtroom was already filling up with the usual crowd. Nervous defendants, anxious lawyers, and court officers moving with quiet urgency. The air was thick with anticipation, as everyone knew what was coming. Judge William Thorne, a man of immense stature both physically and reputationally, had earned his place as one of the most feared figures in Chicago's judicial system. At 62 years old, Judge Thorne had spent 3 decades on the bench, and the reputation he had forged during that time was legendary. The mere mention of his name sent a wave of unease through those who had to appear before him. His stern demeanor, unshakable authority, and notoriously harsh sentences made Monday mornings in his courtroom particularly dreaded by defendants and lawyers alike. Judge Thorne carried himself with the type of solemnity one might expect from someone who had seen it all. His silver hair, always perfectly combed, reflected the experience and gravitas that had come with decades of service. His black robe was pressed so flawlessly that it looked as though it had just come from the dry cleaners, and it was said by the court officers that he ironed it himself every morning, a ritual that, in its own way, symbolized his unyielding control and meticulous nature. As the clock struck 9 a.m., the loud, booming voice of the bailiff echoed through the room. "All rise," the bailiff called, signaling the start of another session. Judge Thorne walked in at exactly 9 o'clock, his face set in its usual frown. He had an unmistakable air of distaste for Mondays, and it was well known throughout the courthouse that he did not take kindly to defendants or attorneys who wasted his time. He marched up to the bench with the measured pace of someone who had long ago decided the course of their day. As usual, his face was etched with disapproval, the frown permanently fixed in place as if it were a natural part of his countenance. "Be seated," he said curtly without even glancing up from his notes. His voice carried the weight of someone who expected immediate compliance, and the room quickly fell into a hushed silence as the people shuffled to their seats, trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Among the crowd was Sarah Washington, who sat quietly in the middle row. She was dressed simply, wearing a pair of blue jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and comfortable sneakers, an outfit that appeared far too casual for the formal setting of a courtroom. Her natural hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore no makeup or jewelry. Unlike others who clutched their tickets and paperwork with nervous hands, Sarah held only her phone and a small parking ticket. She appeared calm, almost serene, as she waited for her case to be called. The courtroom proceeded like clockwork, as it always did on Judge Thorne's watch. One case after another was called, and the judge's mood seemed to grow increasingly worse with each passing defendant. His sentences were swift and unforgiving, and he showed no mercy for late payments or mitigating circumstances. No one was allowed more than 2 minutes to explain themselves, and each decision was delivered with a sense of finality that made it clear that questioning his authority was not an option. When Sarah's case was called, she stood up gracefully, her movements composed and controlled, as she walked toward the front of the courtroom. An elderly woman sitting nearby whispered under her breath, "Poor dear. She picked a bad day to face old Thorne." The comment was barely audible, but Sarah caught it nonetheless. She kept her expression neutral, her eyes focused ahead as she approached the judge. Judge Thorne didn't look up from his papers when Sarah reached the podium. His attention was fixed on whatever he was writing in his notebook, and his reading glasses were perched on the tip of his nose. "Ms. Washington," he said, still not meeting her gaze. "You parked in a loading zone for 45 minutes on Thursday afternoon. Do you deny this charge?" His voice was matter-of-fact, and there was no hint of interest in her explanation. Sarah took a breath and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances." Before she could finish, Judge Thorne interrupted her with a sharp, "It's a simple question. Do you deny parking in a clearly marked loading zone? Yes or no?" The courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable. All eyes were on Sarah now, waiting to see how she would respond to the judge's aggressive questioning. Sarah remained composed. She didn't flinch at his tone, and she kept her posture upright. "No, Your Honor," she replied calmly. I don't deny it. However, there were extenuating circumstances that day. Judge Thorne's eyes narrowed, his patience clearly wearing thin. There are no extenuating circumstances for breaking the law, Ms. Washington. He snapped, cutting her off once again. His voice carried that special tone he reserved for defendants he deemed unworthy of his time. Condescending, dismissive, and harsh. The other people in the courtroom could feel the shift in atmosphere. Some looked on with pity, others with understanding, but all were aware of the growing tension between the judge and Sarah. Sarah, however, remained steady. Her expression was neutral, but inside, she could feel the sting of the judge's bias. She knew this wasn't about the parking violation. It was about something much deeper. Judge Thorne's reputation for treating minorities unfairly was no secret in Chicago, but despite numerous complaints over the years, no one had ever successfully challenged him. His position of power had made him untouchable, and most defendants simply didn't have the resources or willpower to stand up to him. Judge Thorne shuffled through some papers on his desk, his mind already made up. The fine for parking in a loading zone is typically $100, he announced, his eyes flicking up at Sarah briefly. However, given the length of time you were parked there, he paused, glancing at Sarah's casual clothes with obvious disapproval, and your light disregard for business operations in the area, I'm setting the fine at $2,500. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, who had witnessed countless cases and harsh sentences, raised his eyebrows in disbelief at the excessive fine. Sarah, however, didn't react. She stood there perfectly still, her face showing no sign of surprise or anger. The only movement was her right hand, which calmly reached for her phone. Judge Thorne looked at her, expecting her to plead for mercy or ask for more time to pay the unfair fine. But Sarah had something else in mind. She pulled up her banking app with a steady hand and began to scroll through it. The judge's satisfaction was short-lived as he watched her with a mix of impatience and amusement. He assumed she was about to beg for a payment plan. But instead, Sarah spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the silence in the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, "before I pay this fine, I'd like to understand why the amount is 25 times the standard penalty." Judge Thorne's face reddened slightly, and for the first time that morning he seemed thrown off. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a defendant. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice tightening, "this court's decisions are not up for debate. If you can't pay the fine today, we can discuss a payment plan." The condescending smile on his face made several people in the courtroom squirm in their seats. The court clerk, Jenny Martinez, who had been working in this courtroom for 6 months, began typing faster than usual, recording every word of the exchange. She could feel the tension mounting in the room. Sarah, unfazed by the judge's tone, responded evenly, "That won't be necessary, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to understand the legal basis for such a large increase. Is there something specific in my case that warrants this exceptional fine?" The smile that had lingered on Judge Thorne's face disappeared completely. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on his desk, and looked at Sarah with newfound wariness. "Are you questioning my authority, Ms. Washington?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "Not at all, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm questioning the reasoning behind your decision." The entire courtroom held its breath. What had started as a routine hearing in a busy municipal court had now evolved into something much more significant. Sarah Washington, with quiet dignity and measured confidence, had taken a stand against the entrenched bias and unfairness that had defined Judge Thorne's courtroom for years. In that moment, she had not only questioned his authority but had exposed the flaws in his decision-making process, forcing him to reckon with the unjust nature of his own actions. What Judge Thorne didn't know was that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become the most memorable day of his 30-year career. And Sarah Washington, with her calm and unyielding presence, was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. Firmly, Sarah stood her ground, her voice clear and unwavering. "As a citizen, don't I have the right to understand why I'm being fined $2,500 for a standard parking violation?" The fine for this type of violation is usually only $100, Your Honor. A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom as people exchanged curious looks. Officer Thompson, the bailiff, observed the exchange with growing interest. In his 15 years of working this courtroom, he had never seen anyone challenge Judge Thorne so calmly, let alone question his decisions with such poise and professionalism. Judge Thorne, visibly irritated, adjusted his glasses and looked at Sarah with increasing condescension. "Young lady," he began, his voice adopting an even more patronizing tone, "perhaps you don't understand how things work here. This is my courtroom, and I decide the appropriate penalties based on the circumstances." His words were deliberately heavy, intended to remind Sarah of her place in the judicial hierarchy. He was the authority in this room, and anyone who stepped into his domain had to accept it, no questions asked. Sarah, however, was not intimidated. She nodded thoughtfully, not reacting to the judge's tone. "And what circumstances, Your Honor, led to this decision? Is there something in my driving record that concerns you?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. She knew that her record was clean, nothing more than the occasional minor infraction. Judge Thorne, realizing she had placed him in a vulnerable position, shuffled through the papers in front of him. The truth was, there was nothing in her record that warranted such a significant increase in the fine. The longer he searched through the paperwork, the redder his face grew. "Miss Washington, your attitude is not helping your case," he finally warned, his voice rising with an edge of frustration. "I could increase the fine further for contempt of court." The threat hung in the air, but Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly reached into her pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, placing them on her nose. The simple gesture of putting on her glasses seemed to unsettle Judge Thorne, more so than any angry outburst could have. She appeared, in his mind, to be too calm, too composed, and far too knowledgeable for a defendant in his courtroom. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice unwavering, "I've been nothing but respectful. I'm simply exercising my right to understand the judicial process. Would you mind if I took notes?" She pulled out a small notebook from her back pocket and began to flip it open. The motion was deliberate and thoughtful, but it had an effect on the courtroom that no one expected. It made Judge Thorne uncomfortable in a way that words could not. The idea that a defendant was taking notes, documenting the proceedings, and holding the judge accountable was a direct challenge to the usual power dynamics that governed his court. "What exactly are you writing?" Judge Thorne demanded, his voice rising slightly, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I will not tolerate disruptions in my courtroom." His gaze was sharp, and for the first time, there was an edge of panic in his voice as he sought to regain control. Sarah, unbothered by the judge's growing anger, met his gaze and responded calmly, "I'm just documenting today's proceedings, Your Honor. The time, the date, the original violation, and your specific reasons for increasing the fine." She looked up at him with genuine curiosity. "Would you like me to read back what you've stated so far?" The room had fallen completely silent. Even the usual rustling of papers, the faint tapping of keyboards, and the quiet shuffle of feet had ceased. Everyone in the courtroom was now fixated on the exchange. The tension was palpable. Judge Thorne's face, which had been red with anger just moments ago, was now growing even more flushed. His discomfort was evident, and the eyes of everyone in the courtroom were now fixed on him, awaiting his next move. "This is highly irregular," Judge Thorne sputtered, picking up his gavel. His voice cracked with indignation as he banged the gavel against the desk in an attempt to regain control. "I will not have you disrupting my courtroom with these tricks." His words were becoming more disjointed, as if he were struggling to process what was happening. "I'd apologize if asking for clarity seems disruptive, Your Honor," Sarah replied, still writing in her notebook. Her voice remained composed, and she continued documenting the proceedings, every word, every movement. "I'm simply creating a record of this interaction. I'm sure the court keeps similar records, correct?" She glanced meaningfully at Jenny Martinez, the young court clerk, who had been diligently typing away at her computer throughout the proceedings. The implication was clear. Sarah was creating her own record, just as the court did. Judge Thorne, now aware of Jenny's rapid typing, shot her a sharp look, but the clerk pretended not to notice. She kept her eyes fixed on the screen, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. "Enough!" Judge Thorne barked, slamming the gavel down with a force that made the wood reverberate. "Pay the fine or face additional penalties. This is your final warning, Miss Washington." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She simply closed her notebook slowly and placed it back into her pocket. The courtroom was holding its breath. "Of course, Your Honor," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll pay the fine right now." She tapped a few buttons on her phone, confirming the payment in a few quick motions. "Would you like the receipt sent to the court's email, or should I have my office deliver a hard copy?" she asked, her voice sweet but with an undertone of something much more assertive. The words "my office" hung in the air like a heavy weight. The simple mention of her office made Judge Thorne pause for the first time that morning. A slight twinge of uncertainty crept into his demeanor. Who exactly was this woman in simple clothes who took such careful notes, spoke so professionally, and casually mentioned her office? Before Judge Thorne could respond, Jenny Martinez, the court clerk, was scrolling through her own device during a brief lull in the proceedings. Her eyes suddenly widened. She had seen Sarah Washington's face before, but it hadn't clicked until now. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Sarah Washington wasn't just any ordinary person. She was someone far more influential. "Oh my God," Jenny whispered to herself, her eyes glued to the screen of her phone. Her fingers moved quickly to show Officer Thompson the article that had just popped up on her device. The headline was clear: Sarah Washington, the brilliant mind behind Washington Tech Solutions, how this self-made billionaire is changing the future. The article detailed Sarah's meteoric rise in the tech world, highlighting her groundbreaking work in artificial intelligence, and how her company was revolutionizing healthcare. Officer Thompson's mouth dropped open slightly as he read the article on Jenny's screen. The room was now buzzing with whispers as people began to connect the dots. Sarah Washington wasn't just a defendant in Judge Thorne's courtroom. She was a highly successful entrepreneur, a billionaire, and one of the most influential figures in the tech industry. Judge Thorne, still reeling from the revelation, barely noticed the young intern who had rushed to the front of the courtroom holding a newspaper. "Ms. Washington, I'm sorry to interrupt," the intern said, her voice filled with admiration. "Would you mind signing this? Your article about improving access to technology in underprivileged communities was so inspiring." Before Sarah could respond, more people began speaking up, their voices excited and respectful. "My daughter got one of your STEM scholarships. Your company helped provide free AI-powered diagnostic tools to hospitals in underserved areas. Thank you." The gratitude was genuine, but it was clear that Sarah's presence in the courtroom had gone from a routine appearance to something much more significant. As Judge Thorne stood frozen at his bench, his earlier authority slipping through his fingers, he realized that he had underestimated this woman, someone far more powerful and influential than he had ever imagined. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal proceedings. It had become a space of revelation, and Sarah Washington had not only paid her fine but had also given Judge Thorne and everyone else in the room a powerful lesson in humility, justice, and the importance of respecting others, no matter their background or appearance. The courtroom buzzed with energy, but Sarah handled the attention with remarkable grace. She stood there, her posture straight, a calm smile on her face, and she addressed the crowd of people who were now looking at her in awe. "Thank you all," she said in a quiet but firm voice, maintaining her composure while remaining respectful to the ongoing proceedings. She had made her point, and now it was time to move on. "We should respect the court's proceedings," she added, directing the room back to its intended order. She then turned back to Judge Thorne, who was still sitting frozen behind his bench. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her tone still professional, "since my case is concluded, may I be excused?" She didn't wait for him to answer but stood there with an air of calm authority, as though everything about the situation was already behind her. Judge Thorne, unable to respond immediately, could only nod, his earlier arrogance evaporating into thin air. He sat motionless, his eyes wide with shock, his mind still processing the turn of events. This woman, the one he had tried to belittle and intimidate, had just outplayed him at every turn. But Sarah wasn't finished. She wasn't just going to walk out of the courtroom after winning the case. There was one more thing she needed to do, one more point to make. "One more thing, Your Honor," Sarah said, pulling out her notebook again from her pocket. She glanced down at the pages for a moment, gathering her thoughts, then looked back up at the judge, her gaze unwavering. "I noticed some interesting patterns in today's proceedings," she continued. "My legal team will be reviewing the court records from your previous sessions." The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the words sank in. Sarah was not simply finishing her business here. She was sending a clear message. "We believe in equal justice for everyone, regardless of their appearance or social status," she said, her voice steady and resolute. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah spoke these words, the implications clear. Judge Thorne's face turned an alarming shade of pale as he realized the weight of what she was saying. She wasn't just some ordinary defendant. She had the resources, the influence, and the drive to launch a full investigation into his entire record. She could scrutinize every decision he'd ever made from the bench, and she was doing so now. Sarah closed her notebook slowly, her movements deliberate, as if to add to the gravity of the moment. "Have a good day, Your Honor," she said simply, a polite farewell as she turned to leave the courtroom. As she made her way toward the door, she paused for a brief moment by Jenny Martinez's desk. "Ms. Martinez," she said, her tone warm yet professional, "thank you for your diligent record-keeping today. Expect a call from my office. We might need copies of today's transcripts." The courtroom was now stunned into silence, the weight of the moment settling heavily on everyone. Sarah Washington, in her simple jeans and t-shirt, had just dismantled the authority of Judge Thorne with calm precision and left him visibly shaken. As she walked out of the room, there was no fanfare, no dramatic exit, just the quiet dignity that she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Behind her, she left a roomful of astonished onlookers, a judge who had been thoroughly outmatched, and the beginning of what would become a major investigation into judicial bias in the Chicago court system. By noon that same day, Judge William Thorne was sitting alone in his chambers, his mind racing. The reality of the morning's events had already begun to settle in. The courtroom was still buzzing from the spectacle, and news of what had transpired had spread rapidly through social media. A video clip of the moment when Sarah Washington had confronted him in court was already going viral. His phone rang incessantly, and the buzzing was relentless. Local news stations were calling for comments. The chief judge of the circuit court had left him 3 urgent messages, and even his wife had called, having seen the story pop up on Facebook. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said weakly, his voice hoarse. Jenny Martinez entered, holding a stack of papers in her hand. "Sir, these just came from Ms. Washington's office," she said, her tone neutral but not without its own hint of apprehension. She placed the documents on his desk in front of him. "They're requesting records of all your cases from the past 5 years." Judge Thorne stared at the papers in disbelief, the weight of the moment beginning to sink in. "All of them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenny nodded. "Yes, sir. They're particularly interested in cases involving traffic violations and fine amounts." He leaned back in his chair, loosening his collar as the room seemed to grow unbearably hot. The sheer scope of the request, the certainty with which it had been made, and the person making it, it all pointed to a serious challenge to his authority. And this was only the beginning. Jenny hesitated, then spoke again, her voice tinged with unease. "Channel 5 News is outside the courthouse. They're interviewing people from this morning's session. It's all over the news." Judge Thorne ran a shaky hand through his hair. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Washington was already setting the stage for the next chapter of her plan. She sat in her Tesla, still dressed in the same simple jeans and t-shirt, making phone calls. To anyone who passed by, she seemed like just another person. But that was part of her power. Her true influence wasn't in her appearance. It was in her actions. She spoke calmly into the car's speaker system, her voice clear and confident. James, she said to her head lawyer, I want a full investigation, not just into Judge Thorne's records but into every judge in this circuit. Look for patterns in fines, sentencing, and treatment based on race, appearance, or perceived social status. James, her legal team's point person, was already on it. Already on it, he replied. We've got a team of data analysts working on it. The preliminary numbers from Judge Thorne's last 100 cases already show some disturbing patterns. Sarah nodded, even though James couldn't see her. Good. Also, contact the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Send them everything we find. She ended the call just as a message from Judge Thorne's office buzzed onto her phone. They were requesting a private meeting. She smiled slightly as she typed out her response. Any meeting will need to be on record with our legal team present. Back at the courthouse, the morning's other defendants had begun to share their own stories with reporters. The elderly woman who had whispered, "Poor dear," when Sarah first approached the bench was now enthusiastically describing the scene to a news crew. You should have seen his face, she told the reporter, her voice full of excitement. When he found out who she was. Oh my. But the best part was how calm she stayed. Such dignity, such class. Judge Thorne, watching the coverage from his office window, felt the walls closing in. His hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of water. 30 years on the bench, and he had never faced anything like this. His secretary buzzed in without warning. Sir, the chief judge wants to see you immediately. Walking down the courthouse hallway, Judge Thorne felt the shift in the air. The same courthouse staff who had once scrambled to avoid his gaze now watched him with barely concealed smirks. He was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been. The chief judge's office felt colder than usual as Thorne entered. Patricia Rodriguez, the chief judge, didn't offer him a seat. Bill, she said, using his first name for the first time in years, do you have any idea what kind of storm you've created? Sarah Washington wasn't just any billionaire. She was one of the most influential advocates for social justice in the tech world. Her company's AI systems were used by half the civil rights organizations in the country. Judge Thorne slumped in his chair, defeated. I didn't know who she was, he muttered, his voice barely audible. That's exactly the problem, Chief Judge Rodriguez snapped. You shouldn't treat anyone differently based on who they are, rich or poor, famous or unknown. That's basic judicial ethics. As if things couldn't get worse, his secretary rushed in without knocking. Sir, Ms. Washington's team just filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Inquiry Board. They're calling for a complete review of your conduct on the bench. Judge Thorne's world was crumbling around him. The authority he had wielded so carelessly for years was now being turned against him. It all started because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. Outside, Sarah Washington's Tesla pulled away from the courthouse. She had achieved what she set out to do. Not just pay an unfair fine but expose a system that desperately needed change. The real work had just begun. 1 week after the courtroom incident, Sarah Washington's legal team had taken over an entire floor in a downtown Chicago office building. The space was a hive of activity, with 20 data analysts stationed at their computers, sifting through thousands of court records. The walls were covered in charts, graphs, and data visualizations that showed Judge Thorne's sentencing patterns, each one more troubling than the last. Sarah stood in front of the room, dressed in a simple yet professional business suit, as James Chen, her chief lawyer, stood by a large screen presenting the findings. It's worse than we thought, James said, pointing to a colored graph on the screen. In the last 5 years, Judge Thorne has consistently fined minority defendants, on average, 300% more than white defendants for the same violations. Sarah leaned forward, her brow furrowed as she studied the data. She was no stranger to the harsh realities of systemic inequality, but seeing it quantified like this was still striking. She didn't speak immediately, absorbing the gravity of the findings. What about jail time for similar offenses? Sarah asked, her voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. James clicked to the next slide, revealing more disturbing data. Even more alarming, he began, African-American defendants were 4 times more likely to be sentenced to jail time rather than probation for the same crimes. and Hispanic defendants were 3 times more likely. The door to the conference room opened, and Jenny Martinez walked in. After the courtroom incident, Jenny had quit her job as court clerk and joined Sarah's team as a key witness. Her presence brought a sense of validation to the team, as she had first-hand knowledge of the inner workings of the courthouse. She stepped forward, holding up a stack of papers. "More people are coming forward," she announced, her voice full of resolve. "I got 50 new testimonies from previous defendants." Sarah nodded, her expression unwavering. "Good. Keep gathering as much as you can." She turned to address the rest of the team, who were busily working at their computers. "Remember, everyone," she said, her voice carrying authority, "this isn't just about Judge Thorne anymore. We're looking at the entire system. We're shining a light on the pervasive bias that exists in courts everywhere." Across town, Judge Thorne was facing his own crisis. He sat in a sterile meeting room with 3 members of the Judicial Inquiry Board, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. The local news had been running stories about him all week, airing old footage of him in court and interviewing former defendants. The pressure was mounting. One board member, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, spoke first. "Judge Thorne," he began, "we've reviewed the initial evidence. Can you explain why a simple parking ticket resulted in a $2,500 fine for Ms. Washington?" Thorne wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, his mind scrambling for an explanation. I was having a bad day," he stammered, his voice weak. "A bad day?" Another board member, a woman in her 50s, raised her eyebrows incredulously. "We found hundreds of cases where you imposed unusually harsh sentences. Were you having a bad day for the last 5 years?" Before Thorne could respond, his lawyer leaned in and whispered something in his ear. The truth was that Judge Thorne had never thought anyone would actually check his records. For years, he had felt untouchable in his courtroom. The idea that someone like Sarah Washington would question his authority was foreign to him. He had been in control for so long that he didn't believe anyone would challenge him. But now, the reality was sinking in. Back at Washington Tech Solutions, Sarah was meeting with civil rights leaders from across the city. The conference room was packed with community activists, religious leaders, and local politicians. The energy in the room was palpable as Sarah addressed the group. "What we found in Judge Thorne's courtroom isn't unique," she said, showing them the data on a screen behind her. "But we can use this case to push for real change." Reverend Jackson, a longtime civil rights activist, nodded in agreement. "This is the evidence we've needed for years," he said. "But Ms. Washington, taking on the entire judicial system will make you some powerful enemies." Sarah smiled, unfazed by the warning. "I didn't build a billion-dollar company by avoiding challenges, Reverend. Besides, what's the point of having resources if we don't use them to fix broken systems?" Her words were met with nods of approval. The movement was gaining momentum, and she knew the risks, but the fight was too important to back down from. The investigation into judicial bias was making waves far beyond Chicago. National news outlets picked up the story, and other cities began looking into their own court records. Sarah's team received calls from civil rights organizations across the country, all wanting to use her data analysis methods to investigate their own local courts. It was a ripple effect that Sarah had anticipated but had no way of knowing just how quickly it would spread. The story of the biased judge was no longer just a local issue. It was national, and the pressure was mounting on the judiciary at all levels. That evening, Sarah sat in her office, overlooking the Chicago skyline. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. "Judge Thorne just announced he's taking a leave of absence." Sarah had not wanted to destroy the judge's career. Her goal had always been bigger than that. She wanted to change the system that had allowed men like Thorne to abuse their power for so long. But hearing about Thorne's leave of absence didn't bring her any satisfaction. She was focused on the larger fight, not the individual victories. Her assistant walked in, holding a file in his hand. "Ms. Washington," he said, "we found something interesting. Judge Thorne isn't the worst offender in the circuit. There are 3 other judges whose numbers are even more biased." Sarah turned from the window, her mind already racing ahead. "Send everything to James," she said, her voice commanding. and call another press conference for tomorrow morning. As night fell over the city, the lights stayed on in the Washington Tech Solutions building. The team worked late, knowing they were part of something much larger than just exposing one biased judge. They were shining a light on decades of systemic discrimination. They weren't just taking on one individual. They were taking on an entire system that had allowed such inequality to thrive unchecked. Judge Thorne had unknowingly picked the wrong person to discriminate against. His $2,500 fine had been a catalyst for something much bigger. The broken system he represented was about to face scrutiny like never before. His actions, driven by arrogance and prejudice, had set into motion a chain of events that would cost the system much more than money. It was about to cost them their comfort in operating in the shadows, where injustices could be hidden away and ignored. 2 months after the courtroom incident, the Chicago Community Center was packed. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, and crowded the doorways. Sarah Washington stood on stage, addressing over 500 people who had been unfairly treated in traffic court. "Today, we're launching the Fair Justice Initiative," she announced, her voice clear and strong. "This program will provide free legal help to anyone who believes they've been treated unfairly in traffic court. But that's just the beginning." In the front row, Jenny Martinez sat with her laptop, documenting everything. Behind her, a group of law students wore T-shirts with "Justice for All" printed on them. They were part of the new volunteer program Sarah had started. "Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves to be treated with respect," Sarah continued. "It shouldn't matter what they're wearing, what color their skin is, or how much money they have in their bank account." The crowd erupted in applause. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had recently received help from Sarah's team. The judge had fined her $1,000 for a broken taillight, but thanks to Sarah's lawyers, the fine was reduced to $50, the standard amount. At the back of the room, news cameras rolled. This wasn't just a Chicago story anymore. People across the country were watching. "We've already helped 300 people appeal unfair fines," Sarah said, pointing to a large screen behind her. "Together, these fines add up to over $500,000. Money that was taken unfairly from our community." The screen showed photos of families who had received help, including a single mother who had been fined $800 for parking in the wrong spot, and a college student who had received a $1,200 ticket for an expired meter. The Fair Justice Initiative was gaining momentum, and it was just the beginning of the change Sarah hoped to bring to the system. The room at the community center buzzed with energy as Sarah Washington addressed a packed crowd. The overwhelming number of people gathered there had gathered not only because they were curious, but because they had been directly affected by a broken system. Many of them had been the victims of unfair fines and harsh treatment in traffic court, an experience they could no longer ignore. Among the audience was a retired teacher who had been forced to pay $2,000 for missing a stop sign. Her story, like so many others, was one of unfair treatment, where a simple mistake resulted in a financial burden that many could not afford. But Sarah made it clear that this issue wasn't just about money. It was about something far deeper: dignity. Sarah's voice was resolute as she spoke to the crowd. "This isn't just about money. It's about dignity. It's about justice. It's about changing a system that has been broken for far too long." These words echoed throughout the room, resonating with the people who had felt the sting of being treated unfairly. They weren't just looking for financial relief. They were looking for a restoration of their rights, their humanity, and their respect within the legal system. As Sarah spoke, her mind was racing with the next steps in her battle to change the system. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Thorne's courtroom told a story of its own. The once bustling courtroom sat empty, marked by a silence that spoke volumes. Yellow sticky notes were stuck to his bench, indicating evidence that had yet to be fully investigated. Investigators continued to frequent his courtroom, meticulously checking records and taking photographs as they pieced together the scope of the judge's biased behavior. The truth of what had been happening behind closed doors in that courtroom was slowly becoming impossible to deny. Back at the community center, Sarah introduced her next surprise. "Today, we're launching a new app called CourtWatch," she announced, her voice filled with excitement. "Anyone can use it to record their experience in traffic court. The app will automatically analyze fine amounts and look for patterns of unfair treatment. The crowd murmured with excitement as volunteers began passing out phones with the app already installed. The idea of being able to track and analyze unfair treatment in real time empowered the audience, and it was clear that Sarah was providing them not just with hope, but with tangible tools to fight back. But Sarah's announcement didn't end there. "That's not all," she continued, her voice unwavering. "Washington Tech Solutions is setting aside $50 million to help communities fight unfair court practices. This money will cover legal fees, court fees, and investigations. No one should have to face an unfair system alone." The room erupted in applause as the promise of resources and support from one of the most successful companies in the country became a reality for those who had been left to navigate the court system on their own for so long. Among the crowd, a young man named Marcus stood up. His voice shook as he called out, "Ms. Washington, last year I lost my job because I couldn't pay a $500 traffic fine. It turned into $3,000 with late fees, and I had to choose between paying the fine and buying food for my kids." The raw emotion in his voice struck a chord with everyone in the room, and Sarah turned her attention to him, her expression serious and compassionate. "Marcus, your story is exactly why we're here," Sarah said, her voice calm yet firm. "I'm happy to tell you that our legal team will be helping you appeal those fines tomorrow morning." The crowd responded with a wave of applause, and several people in the audience began to cry. For them, hearing Marcus' story and seeing that he would receive the help he needed was a sign that they too could receive justice. They began to share their own stories, telling Sarah about the fines that had crippled them, the legal battles they had lost, and the unfair treatment they had suffered at the hands of the very system that was supposed to protect them. Outside the community center, a small group of protesters stood holding signs that supported Judge Thorne and the current system. Their voices were drowned out by the sounds of hope and change coming from inside the building. While these protesters represented the old guard, those who were comfortable with the status quo, the vast majority of people in the room were pushing for change, real systemic change. As the meeting came to a close, people lined up to sign up for legal help, and Sarah stayed until the last person had been heard, ensuring that everyone who needed assistance would receive it. By the time Sarah left the community center, it was nearly midnight. She checked her phone, and her heart swelled as she saw messages from civil rights leaders in New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. They were all eager to start similar programs in their cities, inspired by Sarah's success in Chicago. What had started as a single incident in a courtroom had now turned into a national movement. Sarah smiled as she read the messages. What Judge Thorne had meant as a punishment had turned into a beacon of hope for thousands of people who had felt powerless against the legal system. His unfair fine hadn't just exposed one biased judge. It had sparked a movement that would help bring justice to countless others. The Fair Justice Initiative was just getting started, and Sarah Washington was ready to take the fight nationwide. 3 months after the launch of the Fair Justice Initiative, Sarah Washington sat in the main hearing room of the Illinois Judicial Board. The room was completely silent as Chief Investigator Robert Martinez presented his findings about Judge Thorne's conduct. He spoke with authority, having reviewed over 10,000 cases from the past 5 years. "We found clear evidence of systematic bias in Judge Thorne's courtroom," Robert said, pointing to a screen behind him, which displayed the damning data. Sarah listened intently, knowing that the moment she had been working towards was finally here. Judge Thorne, once a figure of authority, sat at a table with his lawyers. He looked much older than he had that Monday morning in traffic court. His hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook as he nervously drank water from a paper cup. The weight of the investigation had clearly taken a toll on him. Robert continued, detailing how, in cases involving minority defendants, fines were consistently 3 to 5 times higher than those imposed on white defendants for identical violations. This pattern was present in 92% of all cases reviewed. The board members took notes, their faces grim and serious as the evidence mounted. One of the board members, Judge Patricia Chen, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she addressed Robert. "What about the specific incident with Ms. Washington?" she asked. Robert clicked to the next slide, revealing the stark contrast in sentencing on the day in question. On that day alone, Judge Thorne heard 27 cases, Robert explained. The average fine for white defendants was $125, while for minorities it was $750. Ms. Washington's $2,500 fine for a simple parking violation was the highest amount ever recorded in his court for such an offense. The data was undeniable. In the audience, Jenny Martinez sat with Sarah's legal team. She had brought all the original court records she had saved during her time as a court clerk. Those records had become key evidence in the investigation, and Sarah knew they were crucial in holding Judge Thorne accountable for his actions. As the hearing continued, Judge Thorne's lawyer attempted to defend him. "My client acknowledges that mistakes were made," the lawyer said, but Sarah's team was quick to object. "These weren't mistakes," James Chun, Sarah's lead attorney, argued, standing up. "This was a deliberate pattern of discrimination that lasted for years. It only came to light because Ms. Washington had the resources to challenge it." The hearing continued for hours, but it was clear that the board was leaning toward a decision that would change the course of Judge Thorne's career. Outside the building, protesters held signs reading, "Justice for All" and "End Court Bias." News vans lined the street, and cameras focused on the building's entrance as the hearing finally reached its conclusion. After 6 hours of testimony, the board reached its decision. The head of the board, Justice Maria Rodriguez, cleared her throat before announcing, "William Thorne, this board finds clear and convincing evidence of judicial misconduct. You have violated the fundamental principles of fairness and equality that every judge must uphold." The room grew even quieter as Judge Thorne seemed to shrink in his seat. Therefore, Justice Rodriguez continued, "We order the following. First, your immediate removal from the bench. Second, all fines issued in your court over the past 5 years will be reviewed, and where appropriate, refunded. Third, you will surrender your law license pending further investigation." The room was silent, save for the sound of cameras flashing. Judge Thorne's career was over, but Justice Rodriguez wasn't finished. Furthermore, this board is implementing mandatory bias training for all judges in the circuit. We are also establishing a citizen review board to monitor fine amounts and sentencing patterns in all traffic courts. Sarah nodded quietly. This wasn't just about punishing one judge. It was about making lasting systemic changes. After the hearing, reporters swarmed around Judge Thorne, eager for a comment on the board's decision. But Thorne had no words left. He knew that the fight he had waged against the system was over, and the consequences were far more significant than he could have imagined. The news of Judge Thorne's removal reverberated through the courtroom as the decision was announced. For the first time, the once unshakable judge looked truly humbled. His usual arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by an expression of genuine regret. His voice cracked as he spoke, trying to regain his composure. "I never saw my own bias until it was shown to me in those numbers," he said, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the table. "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused." His apology, though long overdue, seemed sincere, but the damage had already been done. His words were a recognition that a system he had helped uphold was fundamentally flawed, and now he had to face the consequences. Later that evening, Sarah Washington met with her team at their office. The atmosphere was filled with the quiet hum of computers and the soft chatter of voices as they discussed the latest developments. Charts were pinned to the walls, detailing patterns of fines from courts across the state. They were still digging, still gathering evidence, as the Fair Justice Initiative continued to grow. It was no longer just about one judge and one courtroom. It was a movement that had taken root, and now similar investigations were beginning in other cities. James, a key member of Sarah's legal team, spoke up as he examined the latest reports. "Today's decision sets a precedent," he said, looking at the charts. "Other judges will think twice before letting their biases affect their decisions." His words echoed the hope that the ruling against Judge Thorne would serve as a warning to others, encouraging a broader change within the judicial system. Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were focused on the larger picture. She knew this was just the beginning. She turned to her team with a look of resolve. "This isn't about revenge," she said softly. her voice carrying the weight of everything that had happened. It's about making sure every person who walks into a courtroom gets the same fair treatment, regardless of who they are. She wanted the team to understand that while this was a victory, the fight was far from over. It wasn't about punishing individuals but about creating a system that was fair and just for all, regardless of their race, background, or socioeconomic status. As night fell over Chicago, the news of Judge Thorne's removal spread rapidly through social media and news outlets. His story would be remembered in law schools as a cautionary tale about the consequences of judicial bias. But beyond the academic discussions, Thorne's case had become a catalyst for change, opening the door for real reform in America's justice system. The people who had once been silenced by the system were now speaking out, emboldened by Sarah's example. They weren't just seeking justice for themselves, they were demanding a system that worked for everyone. 6 months after Judge Thorne's removal, the Chicago traffic court looked almost unrecognizable. The changes that had taken place in such a short period were profound. New signs were posted throughout the courthouse, printed in multiple languages, explaining people's rights and how to navigate the complex legal system. The court had created a help desk, staffed by law students, to assist people in understanding their tickets and court procedures. But perhaps the most visible change was in the courtrooms themselves. Every courtroom now had a large digital display that showed the average fines for each type of violation. This transparency ensured that no one would be charged more than necessary, and it helped to eliminate any potential for biased decisions. Sarah Washington stood at the back of courtroom 304, the very room where her story had begun. The familiar weight of the space, the same one where Judge Thorne had ruled with an iron fist, now felt lighter. Instead of Judge Thorne's stern face on the bench, Judge Maria Santos, a newly appointed judge, presided over the cases with patience and respect. Judge Santos smiled warmly at the nervous young man who approached the bench, taking the time to explain his rights before listening to his explanation. Then, after considering the details, she issued a fair fine based on the published guidelines that were now posted in every courtroom. It was a small but important victory, a glimpse of what was possible when a judge was willing to treat people with dignity and fairness. As Sarah stood in the back of the courtroom, taking in the sight of these changes, a familiar face approached her. It was William Thorne, the former judge who had been at the center of everything. He looked much older now, his face weathered and humbled by the months that had passed since his removal. His once arrogant demeanor had been replaced with quiet contrition. "Miss Washington," he said softly, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Sarah nodded, acknowledging him without any hint of the hostility that had once been present between them. They walked together to a nearby conference room, where Jenny Martinez and James Chun were already waiting. The room was quiet as Thorne sat down, his hands folded in his lap, clearly uncomfortable. He seemed like a different man, one who had spent the last several months reflecting on his past actions and working to make amends. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Thorne began, his voice steady but soft. "And more importantly, a lot of learning." He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "The bias training program. It opened my eyes to things I never wanted to see in myself." He exhaled slowly. "I spent the last 3 months working with the Fair Justice Initiative, reviewing cases and helping to identify other judges who show patterns of bias. It's my way of trying to make things right." Sarah listened intently, recognizing that this was no longer the arrogant judge who had once dismissed her. This was a man who had come to terms with his flaws and wanted to make amends. She nodded, impressed by his willingness to face his own wrongdoing. "How has the experience been?" she asked. Thorne looked down for a moment before answering. "Humbling," he admitted, his voice tinged with emotion. "Reading through those cases, seeing the impact of unfair fines on families, I realize now how much damage I did from that bench." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "One woman lost her home because she couldn't pay a fine I gave her. Another man missed his daughter's wedding because he was afraid of coming to court over a parking ticket." He paused again, his eyes welling with tears. It was clear that the weight of his past actions was hitting him hard. This wasn't the same man who had once tried to humiliate Sarah. This was someone who had undergone a profound transformation. That's why I'm here today, Thorne continued, pulling out some papers from a folder. I'm starting a program to help former judges learn about their biases and work to fix the system they helped break. Would your initiative consider supporting it? Sarah was taken aback by the question, but in a way it made perfect sense. This was exactly the kind of change she had hoped for, not just punishing individuals but transforming people and systems. Send the proposal to James, Sarah replied, her voice firm with conviction. We'll review it carefully. She saw potential in Thorne's plan and knew that supporting it could help create lasting change. Later that afternoon, Sarah attended a ceremony at City Hall. The mayor stood before a crowd, preparing to sign new legislation that had been inspired by Sarah's case. The legislation set strict guidelines for traffic court fines and required regular audits of judicial decisions to ensure fairness and transparency. The mayor beamed as he announced, "Thanks to Miss Washington's courage and resources, Chicago now has the most transparent traffic court system in the nation." The new law, dubbed the Equal Justice Act, was a landmark moment in Sarah's journey. But the victory wasn't limited to Chicago. Other cities across the country were already asking for help in implementing similar reforms. Back at Washington Tech Solutions, Sarah met with her team one last time that day. The walls that once displayed evidence of Judge Thorne's bias now showed data from courts across the country. The CourtWatch app had been downloaded millions of times, and people everywhere were using it to monitor their local courts. We've helped over 10,000 people appeal unfair fines, Jenny reported, her voice filled with pride. And the new guidelines have prevented countless others from being unfairly charged in the first place. Sarah looked around at her team. Lawyers, data analysts, community organizers, and volunteers, who had all worked tirelessly to make this movement a reality. What had started as one woman standing up to an unfair fine had grown into a national movement for judicial reform. Remember that Monday morning? Jenny asked with a smile. When Judge Thorne thought you couldn't afford the fine? Sarah laughed softly, remembering the moment. Sometimes the best way to fight injustice is to let it reveal itself. He never asked what I did for a living. He just saw what he wanted to see. As Sarah prepared to leave for the day, she received one last piece of news. The National Judicial Council had adopted her team's guidelines for fair fines, making them the new standard across the country. A simple parking ticket had started it all, but thanks to Sarah Washington's courage, resources, and determination, millions of Americans would now face a fairer justice system. Judge Thorne's story had become a pivotal moment in the fight for justice. And in Chicago, a former judge was teaching others about the importance of seeing people for who they really are, not just for what they appear to be.